Horace Walpole was the youngest son of Sir Robert Walpole, who's usually described as Britain's first Prime Minister. Like all younger sons, he didn't inherit the great country house, Houghton Hall, but he did inherit a very useful £2,000 a year. So he was able to be an MP, be an author, be a critic, be a great collector, and of course to build Strawberry Hill, his villa at Twickenham by the Thames. Well, interesting, Walpole is always described as an eccentric, and you therefore imagine him as being this rather crazy fellow who dresses in funny clothes, probably rather extravagantly, but in fact he was a rather respectable, sort of quiet person. You could call him, he's a sort of person who was always the observer at the party, you know. He was standing on the edge of the party, watching what everybody else was doing, and then he would, of course, go home and write it down in his letters to his friends. I don't think he was an eccentric in the way that we would now call people an eccentric. And if it's certainly not eccentric to have parties. And he was very good at parties, and they were completely stage managed. That's the thing about Walpole's parties. So that everything was completely controlled. You arrived at Strawberry Hill, you went to see the printing press, and as you went, which was the first private printing press in England, actually, and as you went into the printing press, a verse in your honour was being printed as you entered the door. It was that kind of controlled party. One of the things that has made this exhibition easier to do when you think that Walpole collected thousands and thousands of things, so the first question a curator has to ask is, what are we going to put in the exhibition? Fortunately, Walpole wrote a list that he called his list of principal curiosities, which is about 87 things out of the thousands and thousands of things, and 25 of those things are coins, so that it's a very small list, and so that's how we know what really excited Walpole. And interestingly, those things are the things that would excite us now. You know, if you take the Michelin guide, they are worth a detour. If you were at a museum and you read it in a list, you would want to see that particular thing. So the highlights, his highlights, would now be our highlights, which isn't to say that it didn't also collect a lot of rather odd things. And of course, what Walpole really loved was things with a story, particularly things that related to famous people or famous events in history. And he saw his collection as a whole as reflecting tides in history, really. It's a unique opportunity to see an 18th century collection brought together in the way that people saw it in the 18th century. Because the combination of things in this show is different from what you'd see in a modern museum. So especially interesting is the way that Walpole mixes up what we would call genuine objects and what we would now call copies, because in the 18th century the whole idea of artistic genius residing in one object didn't really exist, and the copies were almost as valuable as the real thing. The first thing I want people to do is to come away from this exhibition knowing that he actually collected things of really high aesthetic value. That he was, you know, at least as good as William Beckford, who's the great 19th century collector in this field, in the whole aesthetic way. I'd also like people to come away from this exhibition with the idea that Strawberry Hill sort of sat at the coming together of the old way of collecting and the new way of collecting, so that it was a bit of a cabinet of curiosities, but it was also the beginning of the modern museum, because Strawberry Hill was a thematized house, so that you went into a room and everything was to do with Holbein or the early 16th century. And so that it was, in a way, it was a pioneering collection in that way, and that's what I'd like people to go away with.